loud. All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here. My name is Ann Pfister. I'm Associate Professor of Anthropology at the University of North Florida and current Director of the Digital Humanities Institute, or DHI. The DHI promotes collaboration on interdisciplinary projects that combine the use of technology with materials and methodologies from the humanities, fine arts, and social sciences. The DHI is composed of faculty and students across UNF. It's an intercollegial institute bringing together student and faculty interests and expertise through a variety of venues, including today's discussion. So let's see, we are thrilled to welcome Dr. Caitlin Bruce, whose PhD is from Northwestern University. Caitlin is, Dr. Bruce rather, is an associate professor of communication at the University of Pittsburgh. Her research and teaching explore questions of affect, visual culture, memory, and temporality, urban space, and transnational movement. Dr. Bruce has done site-based research in the US, Mexico, Colombia, Germany, and France. She's fortunate to have been supported by fellowships from the Paris Program in Critical Theory, the Fulbright Robles Garcia Postdoctoral Fellowship, and the Gerda Henkel Foundation, among other funding streams. Her work has appeared in venues including the Quarterly Journal of Speech, CCC, CCCS, Geohumanities, Subjectivities, Public Art, Dialogue, and Women's Studies and Communication. Her first book, Painting Publics, Transnational Legal Graffiti Scenes as Spaces for Encounter, from Temple University Press in 2019, received the Urban Communication Foundation Jane Jacobs Book Award, and she received the RCT Early Career Award in 2019. Her second book, Voices in Aerosol, Youth Culture, Institutional Attunement, and Graffiti in Urban Mexico, will be published with University of Texas Press in the fall of 2023. Congratulations, Caitlin. She is program director and co-founder of Hemispheric Conversations, Urban Art Project, a collaborative program that generates public dialogues, murals, and youth street art workshops. You can learn more about Caitlin and her work at caitlinfrancisbruce.com. So this afternoon, Dr. Bruce will talk to us about, forgive me for going back and forth between your first name and Dr. Bruce. This afternoon's talk is entitled Imagining Repair Through Social Infrastructure, Sibyl's Shrine. So it's my pleasure to hand it over to my friend and colleague, Dr. Bruce. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Dr. Pfister, for inviting me to speak today. I'm really happy to be here virtually and excited for the conversation that we'll have. And for anyone that is watching asynchronously, do feel free to reach out to me via email if you have any questions. A special thanks to Alex for their organizational labor, to Naomi and Honey for speaking with me and my students about Sibyl's Shrine, to my research assistant, Alex Holguin, and to my writing group, compañeras, Amy Lewick and Karen Wedby. So this talk is a really early stages research project, so I hope that it will be sort of a good look at that process, which also means that I'm very excited to hear feedback and questions and thoughts of all kinds, because it's pretty tentative. So I'm going to start by sharing my PowerPoint. Let's see. Let me make this a little larger. And Anne and Karen, you can let me know if it's not showing up, but I think it should be.
It's loading right now. Is that what you see on your screen?
It says it's paused. I'm not sure.
Okay.
Let's see. Yeah, it seems every time I make it large, it pauses. So I guess we are stuck with the small version. Let's see. Okay. All right, that's a little bit annoying, but hopefully still visible. So I'll make this a little larger. All right. So I'm going to start with two artifacts. So this first one is a quote from Linda Nochlin. So Linda Nochlin writes, "Behind the most sophisticated investigations of great artists, more specifically the art historical monograph, which accepts the notion of the great artist as primary and the social and institutional structures within which he lived and worked as mere secondary influences or background, lurks the golden nugget theory of genius and the free enterprise conception of individual achievement. On this basis, women's lack of major achievement in art may be formulated as a syllogism. If women had the golden nugget of artistic genius, then it would reveal itself. But it has never revealed itself. QED, women do not have the golden nugget of artistic genius. If Giotto, the obscure shepherd boy, and Van Gogh with his fits could make it, why not women?" So that's one sort of framing statement to think about this relationship between infrastructure, art production, gender, and later we'll also think about this in relationship to race. The second artifact is a video from the Sibyl Shrine Instagram page. So I'll just play the first few minutes of it.
Hey, Alisha, why did Sibyl's Shrine extend its home residency application deadline?
Well, Jessica, I'm glad you asked that question. We extended our Sibyl Shrine residency because we need more moms to apply. We know you're out there. We know you want to apply. We know that, and it's not just about, even though we got more applications than there are spots, it's not about that. It's about letting us know who you are. It's about letting us know how we can help you. Maybe even if you don't fit into these 3 slots that we have for this particular time, we are going to do more. We are constantly growing and adapting. We want to be very in sync with Octavia Butler's parable of the star. God has changed. We are constantly changing. We want to be everything Black creative moms need in Pittsburgh.
Am I an artist? I never went to school for this, and I don't have a traditional arts practice, but I am really creative and I do make things.
This whole "I'm not an artist" thing has got to stop. Don't nobody got time for that. I didn't go to art school. I do all kinds of crazy things that, the boundaries of art are ever expanding because we are moving past white supremacy. Okay. If you garden, you're an artist, you're a maker, you're a creator. If you're an activist, an educator, if you write poems, if you, you're a yoga instructor, a healer, these are all arts practices. And we want to, share that with you. If you sing, if you do all of these things, if you don't have an arts career, that's totally fine. We still want you to apply. This can still support you. This is about supporting the livelihoods of Black moms in Pittsburgh, Black creative moms. It's about the fact that most people don't even get to pursue creativity because we are trying to feed our family. And so we want to support you there, just even figuring out if you want to pursue creative practice. So you should really just apply.
So the video goes on to kind of talk through other frequently asked questions like, what does a reference look like? How do I sort of articulate my body of work? And the artists, so Jessica Gaynelle Moss and Alisha Wormsley, go on to kind of break down some of the more hidden sort of transcript side of the art world. So for instance, Alisha Wormsley talks about how, she applies to 20 things a year and maybe gets 1, and that's like what's real. So I contrast these two things to think about questions of labor, infrastructure, race, gender, and art, and also their where, like WHERE, and how. So Pittsburgh as a city has routinely displaced its Black residents from neighborhoods like the Lower Hill District, East Liberty, Wilkinsburg, and other sites due to unrestricted real estate speculation, exclusive urban renewal practices, a paucity of affordable housing options, and other issues. Mindy Thompson Foley Love describes such dislocation as a form of root shock that disrupts social networks and weakens ties. Cultural workers have long documented and criticized such inequality. So for instance, Teenie Harris's photographic practice back in the 60s offered a rich archive of the social networks and unique people who lived in and were displaced from places like the Hill. Meanwhile, contemporary photographer and performance artist LaToya Ruby Frazier questions post-industrial progress narratives for towns like Braddock, where pollution and underemployment and over-policing and lack of social services result in diminished life chances for residents. Likewise, multimedia artists like Alisha Wormsley offer interventions in public space as well as archival experiments to imagine a future where Black people are not only present in Pittsburgh's present, but also thriving in Pittsburgh's future. So I recently attended a grant writing workshop where a colleague who had run many multi-million-dollar projects spoke about a failed proposal to build a city in the lower orbit of space and compared the opportunity to, quote, being in Pittsburgh in the 1770s, end quote. In the 1770s, Pittsburgh was about to become a site for massive resource extraction, industrial might, migration waves, and capital intensification that then resulted in a rich set of commercial, regulatory, and material infrastructures. When asked how he pitched the proposal, he mentioned, quote, space tourism for billionaires. In this short example, Pittsburgh offers a kind of metaphor that can activate an imagined geography for future infrastructural investments. And of course, it's always worth connecting the metaphor to the materiality of the city. True, Pittsburgh was the site of vertical integration, subject to the shrewd calculations of industrial tycoons like Andrew Carnegie and Henry Clay Frick. But it was also the site of labor unrest and resistance, physical toil and sacrifice, and an ongoing space for social inequality where those with less power to be owners of their own labor and space are excluded from decision-making in ways that I outlined above. In short, the geography of Pittsburgh as a potential boom town is dependent on the expulsion and exploitation of land and people. For Black womxn caretakers and artists and mothers living in Pittsburgh, the effect of such root shock is felt disproportionately. One of the collaborators in Sibyl Shrine, Naomi Chambers, who's a painter and a multimedia artist, noted, quote, that her daughter Dottie is 4 years old and she's lived in 3 different apartments in 3 different areas, Swissvale, Wilkinsburg, the Hill. We just move, end quote. Chambers and her partner, also an artist, had created a community art space in the Pittsburgh adjacent borough of Wilkinsburg, and they named the art space Flower House. Flower House was a place for communal making, everyday hanging out, skill sharing, family celebrations, and so on. Housing pressures led to them leaving that first physical site for the project. Geographer Catherine McKittrick argues that race and racism are serious geographic projects and processes, and assumptions about, quote, transparent space, end quote, the idea that, quote, geography, specifically physical and material geographies, is readily knowable, bound up with ideologies and activities that work to maintain a safe socioeconomic clarity, end quote, occludes the many ways that space and place are socially produced and sustain social inequality or uneven geographies and maintain violence. And when I talk about the social production of space, basically what I'm flagging here is the way that ongoing social processes, decisions, and economic and political calculations actually go into spaces appearing as they are, even though they might seem natural or just ordinary. So here's a longer quote from McKittrick. One of the many ways that violence operates across gender, sexuality, and race is through multiscalar discourses of ownership. Having things, owning lands, invading territories, possessing someone are in part narratives of displacement that reward and value particular forms of conquest. And this reward system repetitively returns us to the body, Black subjecthood, and the wear of Blackness, not just as it's owned, but as Black subjects participate in ownership. Black diasporic struggles can also be read then as geographic contests over discourses of ownership of the body, individual and community voices, bus seats, women, Africa, feminism, history, homes, record labels, money, cars, recurring positionalities written and articulated through protest music, feminist theory, fiction, and the everyday. So I offer this quote to connect back to Chambers' comment about her lived experience, which is a microcosm of Pittsburgh's macro histories, and it attunes us to the way that place, space, gender, race, and embodiment are always intertwined. Whether it's the precipice of an industrial boom or the upswing of what's now being called the city's eds and meds renaissance, space is never experienced as transparent or abstract, but it's always a differentiated, differently experienced terrain. And so McKittrick offers this idea of Black feminist geographies as a different way of understanding space, recognizing the unevenness of space, as well as, quote, cycles of racial sexual domination and oppositional geographic practices, end quote. And drawing on Antillean philosopher Edward Glissant's notion of the poetics of landscape, McKittrick specifically emphasizes creative acts and self-naming as important ways in which space can be re-experienced, re-articulated, transformed. And so here are a couple of longer quotes about that, so you can kind of read at your leisure. But I think what Sibyl Shrine raises as a question is, what is required to engage in expressive and creative acts? Recall that Alisha Wormsley discusses in the video that for many people to even engage in creativity requires first satisfying questions of how to provide for one's kin and family. As the Knocklin quote I opened with suggests, creativity is never a golden nugget model of genius. It's about social infrastructure, the resources, the forms of support, and the larger institutional and cultural milieu of opportunity, remuneration, and recognition in which an artist is embedded that might promote their work or make it difficult to do so. In other words, social infrastructure is the term that I use to describe the mechanisms that make possible expressive and creative processes, or the poetics of landscape and expressive acts and creative acts that McKittrick so beautifully elucidates. So communal spaces have long been one form for social infrastructure, and these spaces are often informal or extra institutional. Again, and this kind of challenges a lot of dominant social theories about civil society and the public sphere. Sibyl Shrine, which is an artist residency program developed by Wormsley, Chambers, and Moss, drew on grant funding to offer slightly more formal forms for social infrastructure building between and among Black women, femme, non-binary artists, mothers, and caretakers using the affordance of digital spaces like Zoom and Instagram. So in this presentation, I'll explore how the online element of Sibyl Shrine residencies offered a kind of, quote, virtual beauty shop. And this concept of the virtual beauty shop comes from communication scholar Catherine Knight Steele's work, which attends to how Black feminists use digital spaces for communal support, for creativity, for self-naming, place-making, place-naming, place-claiming, and place-keeping. And so Sibyl Shrine offers an example of communal praxis that helps us think about space and place differently. Navigating digital archives of placemaking in the context of confinement, misnaming, and displacement in a world that tries to relegate Black women and femmes to no place, it offers instances of renaming and place claiming and place keeping between digital and physical sites. So in what remains of my time, I'll speak a tiny bit about how I came to this project and some of the methods I use. I'll talk a bit more about Sibyl Shrine and their on and offline ecosystem, and we'll look at a couple of examples to think about how their Instagram page offers a deliberately unstable and fragmented archive of the residency as a kind of virtual beauty shop. And I'll close with a reflection and some questions about how to think about some of these issues of ownership in the context of platform capitalism and racial capitalism. So a little bit about method. So this presentation is drawn from a combination of an in-person interview in 2020, after I met some of the artists involved through my own public art programming, Zoom visits that interlocutors did with my students in a Rhetoric of Space and Place class in 2021, and an unconference that I organized in 2022, as well as the digital archive that my graduate assistant put together of the Instagram posts and of commentary about the collective. And then finally, site visits to 2 exhibits that Sibyl Shrine had in Pittsburgh over the last 2 years, as well as just following their digital presence on Instagram over the past 3 years. So I try to approach the writing of this work as a kind of supporter, not as a neutral observer. I myself am a mixed race, white appearing mother. And so some of the questions that the project engages are very close to some of the experiences I'm starting to have, while others are more distant. And I can talk more about that if there are questions. So let's talk a bit about the collective. So Sibyl Shrine is an artist network for Black artist caretaker mothers, founded by Alisha Wormsley and co-run with Gaynelle Moss and Naomi Chambers. And it was created to address multiple inequalities in terms of care and labor and artistic infrastructure. In the art world, many professional opportunities presume that the artist occupies the social position of usually a solitary, white, male, cis, able-bodied genius who can kind of do their work at any time and has the privilege to accept opportunities that often offer benefit in terms of exposure, or if they do get remuneration, it's often fellowships and residencies that don't really assume that anyone has any kind of network to sustain. So they're not usually friendly to caretaking activities. And such assumptions are extensions of a larger patriarchal culture that often renders invisible the work of social reproduction that makes possible the particular kinds of waged work that other folks do. So this invisibility is also spatially rooted, as McKittrick and Doreen Massey have argued. In Naucklin's germinal essay, Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists, Naucklin asks the question to point to, quote, discrepancies in opportunity in archive, institution, and education, quote, acknowledging further disparities that are due to race. Naucklin argues that the myth of the great artist writes the story of greatness by basically writing out the social networks and forms of privilege that render some artists recognizable and laudable. And issues of institutional access and resource equity require an intersectional lens to understand how different elements of identity further compound unequal infrastructural landscapes. What also I think is important to pay attention to is the context for the creation of this collective. So it was founded in May of 2019, and the name Sibyl references priestesses who served the African goddess Mami Wata, and is described on the website as, quote, an arts collective and residency program rooted in radical care, rest, and support for Black women, womenx, trans women, and femmes, who are mothers, and mothers is spelled /others, you can see on the slide, who identify as artists, creatives, and activists in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and beyond. And it has three kinds of residencies: home residencies, visiting artist residencies, and community artist residencies, usually supporting 3 local artists over the course of 12 weeks. But in 2020, the novel coronavirus came to the US, causing massive illness, death, disproportionately impacting communities of color, causing long-term lockdowns in many cities around the world. And schools, stores, cultural, and other institutions were mostly physically closed. And so that also meant that cultural workers, and in particular parents and caregivers, found themselves in the position of having to try to create work and educate and care for others in isolation. Additionally, ongoing police violence against people of color led to national and international uprisings in support of the movement for Black lives, uprisings that were often met with yet more violence, racist media frames, and government mendacity. And this was the case in Pittsburgh, where, as I discussed earlier, there's a very long history of the city being one of the least livable for Black women. So art residencies usually function as opportunities for artists to go away from home, to provide protected time and space to create one's work. And so if you talk about a residency, usually what comes to mind is some sort of whimsical cottage or a very airy, quiet studio space. It's a kind of romanticized idea of like home without the labor of actually maintaining home. But the idea of protected space and time did not function the same way in 2020. So instead, Sibyl Shrine organizers turned to digital residencies for a cohort of artists, both within Pittsburgh and beyond Pittsburgh. So they invited 30 local and national artists to participate in weekly Zoom meetings over 12 weeks. Naomi Chambers explained that the program was meant to challenge the isolation that artists faced, and it functioned to, quote, give Black mothers hope, so that they know there's this other network of mothers and we're here for each other, and we see the things that we don't like about the world for so long. And I feel like we're starting to realize that we can change because the world is us and it's a reflection of us. And the more we change our habits and the more we do things that are just good for each other, the more the world will start to ripple and change. But it's still hard sometimes being in this city, unquote. So this comment by Chambers points to the way that listening to and supporting Black women is crucial to larger social transformation and liberation, and that her and her colleagues' experiences of difficulty in Pittsburgh are related to larger structural challenges demanding communal support. And so the shift from in-person to digital residencies recognizes this kind of bleed that always occurs between intimate and public, digital and physical, and the seemingly written in stone and the imaginative. And this is something that feminist collectives have always had to account for. So I will now kind of turn to some of the Instagram archives and think about how they might function as what Night Steele has termed a virtual beauty shop. So Night Steele names the virtual beauty shop as a way to describe social and communal processes and spaces and places where such activities are carried out, as well as the ethics that are involved in being in such places. And so here's a quote from Night Steele. The virtual beauty shop offers us a way to understand how Black feminists have created a relationship with agency, community, and profit in a digital context that mirrors their offline practices. Within these discursive communities, bloggers develop practices and principles that we now see on multiple digital platforms and in the public speeches and writing of Black feminists today. These principles are the prioritization of agency, the reclamation of the right to self-identify, centralization of gender, non-binary spaces of discourse, and the creation of complicated allegiances, and the insertion of a dialectic of self and community interests, end quote. So here, Night Steele is naming social and communal processes, spaces and places, and ethics. And it evokes the idea of a kind of enclave space where women, femmes, and non-binary folks do the important work of social reproduction in the kind of gray area of public and private. And Night Steele emphasizes that such liminal spaces are crucial to digital Black feminists, particularly because Black women were explicitly excluded from the, quote, cult of true womanhood, end quote, in the United States, even though their ingenuity and their labor made its evocation possible. And so digital tools, Night Steele emphasizes, allow Black feminists to, quote, curate life on their own terms, affords agency over their images, end quote, even though platforms like Meta might still own their data. And so because of such ownership challenges, it's strategic to develop multiple platforms through which feminists can communicate about challenges and opportunities and sharing and supporting their work. And so here I'm going to actually just move to think about some of the examples. And so I'll open with a quote from Sarah Honey Young. So Sarah Honey Young is a photographer and a DJ who was one of the artists in residence for Sibyl Shrine. And this is her discussion of her work. So she says, I aim to contextualize our own experience as its own museum of modern art. If Black lives matter, Black dreams matter too. We're worthy of being depicted in all of the ways we can fantasize about and make possible. And I envision my work functioning as a time capsule of activism and revolution in transformative times. And she went on to say in her class visit that Instagram was a very important platform for her own work, precisely because it's a highly visual media. And so a few examples from the Instagram account for Sibyl Shrine. So one of the themes that sort of emerged is the idea of sharing opportunities. So this is a post that's basically a kind of report back about the experience on the platform or the channel for the Office of Public Art, which were one of the primary founders for the organization. And so here is this moment of sort of inside-outside communication showing sort of glimpses of the more intimate work of the Zoom meetings, but for like a broader audience. There's also ongoing use of opportunity sharing. So here's a screenshot of one of the initial posts calling for applicants for the residencies. And this led to the later video that I opened the talk with. And there are other posts that were often shared about other opportunities in Pittsburgh, beyond Pittsburgh, sometimes related to the arts, sometimes related to caregiving, but in all cases, just trying to connect people to skills, resources, and so on. There's also a theme that emerges of traces of intimacy, showing everyday life, interrelationality, and sort of documentation of the art process and practice. And so kind of moving clockwise, in the top, there's a shot of one of Naomi Chambers' paintings. And it was part of a sort of day-long takeover that she did of the Instagram account. So many of the different fellows took over the account. Sometimes they would use their name, they would sort of sign off with their own handle. Sometimes they wouldn't. And so there's also kind of an interesting play between anonymity and collectivity as well as sort of individuality. You know, below that, we can see a work in progress for another artist. If we keep going to the left, there's a snippet of a closing meditation that was led by another artist in residency. And then finally, a screenshot of the meeting with the caption, "We love all Black mamas." with participants smiling for the camera, various backgrounds, right? Some of them are sort of virtual backgrounds. Some of them have their kids peeking out. Some of them are more domestic interiors. Some of them seem more like their offices, kind of showing the variety of spaces and places that the artists in residence are taking up. Also sort of sharing moments of joy and what are sort of the resources that folks use to not just to survive, but to thrive. So one artist spoke about their jasmine plant, another shared a photograph of flowers outside of a library in Braddock. And so we see here the traces of building and sustaining social infrastructure where fine art and craft and the art of social reproduction exist in relationship to each other, not just in hierarchy. Taking the form of short musings about everyday life, thoughts about embodiment, guided meditations, and reflections on or process photos of art practice. So I'll wrap up here. And so here are examples of some of the announcements about the home residencies and the visiting residencies that happened in 2021. So these actually led to 2 exhibits at the Mattress Factory, which is a really celebrated installation art museum in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where fellows and artists in residence had collective exhibits that stood for about 6 months each. And it's a really important site for recognition. But I think the sort of physical exhibits that might be seen as sort of like the endpoint, which definitely it was not, are as important as some of this background process-based work that was sort of happening on and offline in the years before. So I would like us to think about social infrastructures as the kind of roots that Mindy Thompson Fully Love described as being torn asunder when communities are dispossessed. And so while the concept of the public sphere often lowers the volume on the world making and sustaining labor of those who are formally and informally excluded, social infrastructures are more than public and they're connected to care. And care is infrastructural insofar as it always attends to the need for systemic and distributed practices of attention necessary to support life. So from Zoom check-ins to pool parties, Sibyl Shrine offers a model of social infrastructure building built from and for Black womenx artists at the intersections. One of the concluding questions that I have, however, is about how to navigate platforms not of one's own control that are often driven by obfuscation and homophilia. And these are very fancy terms that are used to basically describe, on the one hand, the idea that private platforms are driven by non-transparent algorithms and avaricious profit motives that don't make clear how they route engagements. And this is Tressie McMillan Cottom's term. Homophilia is the term that Wendy Chun uses to describe how platforms actually are often organized to promote social engagement along the lines of social sameness rather than social difference, such that one is never encountering an other, but rather different iterations of the same. So given that platforms like Instagram are owned by oligopolies like Meta, how are spaces claimed and sustained in the wake of private ownership schemes where these spaces might be erased overnight? So this is not a new question, but it's definitely a question that kind of connects us back to some of these larger issues about ownership, placemaking, placekeeping, and renaming that I talked about at the outset of the talk. But I would wrap up by saying that Sibyl Shrine raises important lessons about how to navigate space, place, and identity and histories and futures through forms of mutual accountability and interaction. So I'll stop there and we could leave some time for questions. Thanks very much.
Oops. Thanks so much, Dr. Bruce. Oops, we lost somebody. Yeah, wonderful. What questions or comments do we have? I can go.
Great presentation.
Oh.
I don't know if I have any questions, but it was really, really great. Thank you for sharing.
Thanks, Alex.
Yeah, thanks, Alex, and thanks for being here. So I have a couple of comments and questions. One, I'll go ahead and start unless anyone else wants to get the conversation going. So I loved the idea of the virtual beauty shop, and I wanted to hear a little bit more about that. But then I was also drawn in early, and I see the connection between that golden nugget. I mean, especially with Easter coming up this weekend, and we think about like the golden ticket or the golden egg or whatever else, right? It's like the lucky few, right? That have this, or that are gifted, you know, it's like this otherworldly kind of luck. And so bringing that back to structural forces, right? I mean, the opportunity is the golden nugget, right? In very many ways, especially for some of the participants that you're working with. And I had another point about that, which is, oh yeah, when one of the participants said, well, am I an artist? These are the things I do. I'm a creator, I'm a creative, I can't remember what the questions were, but that informal questioning shows us how the golden, you know, how opportunity and that golden nugget are related, right? So anyways, that was one of the comments that I had.
Thanks. Yeah, that's really helpful. And I mean, I think one of the things that I want to draw out as I keep working on this is that, you know, really these artists are teaching us about the sort of abundance of skills. Well, there is abundance in the world. There's a richness of skills that these creatives have. But the way that the art world and still a lot of professional worlds are designed is through a logic of scarcity.
Right.
Competition. Yeah.
And that's where the golden something really kind of stands out and works. I think the way that you're using it is that, you know, that's the precious resource, and that's the gold standard too, right?
Mm-hmm.
So gold as a metaphor, I think, works for you on multiple levels, really, in this work.
Mm.
But when we're talking about, you know, young mothers, that question of, am I an artist, especially in these stages of emerging adulthood, which is a concept that I just learned about from some social work colleagues yesterday. You know, the emerging adult who's in such liminal spaces oftentimes, right, doesn't always see themselves as an artist, let alone have the opportunity maybe to really be rewarded for their artistry, right? Especially when you compound multiple things like, you know, housing, unstable housing, you know, young motherhood, those kinds of things. Anyways,
Yeah.
I enjoyed it. I think it's really an effective way to think about these things.
Thank you. Yeah, and I guess one other thing I was going to say, I'm still sort of figuring out how to talk about the relationship between the kind of process that builds up to the exhibits. But I mean, in the last exhibit that happened in Pittsburgh, one of the not an artist in residence, but basically there were physical exhibits, there was like a satellite space, there were a series of events that happened around it to kind of like activate those spaces. And the last exhibit was called Shrine. So it's sort of about like celebrating and, you know, the sacredness of this work. And there was kind of like basically a prayer that was put on the wall of the museum for entering. And I really liked the framing of it. And I had a version of it, this paper, and it was just a little bit too much to contextualize. But basically, Janera Solomon, who's another artist, Black mother, artist, caretaker, cultural programmer, used to run the Kelly Strayhorn Theater, has done a ton of important work in Pittsburgh, kind of framed this work as sacred, but also all of us as beneficiaries of the work. So there's a question of benefit as well as like abundance that is, I think, in relationship to, you know, contesting the notion of the golden nuggets. It's like, actually, like, if we build frameworks for supporting professional work that benefits everyone, in particular Black mothers, like that's a better world. I think that's a world that we want to be in.
Certainly. Are there other questions or comments?
I just wanted to say how much I enjoyed your presentation. And and sort of building off the question of the golden nugget, the struggle to find voice and vision as an artist, as you say, is so deeply connected to the problem of finding place and space for coming together in community. And we see the history of those communities being invaded and displaced and lost in the physical world. I find it fascinating as we shift to the online environment during the pandemic, that struggle to find a place online. And the places that we find end up frequently being privatized spaces, as in Instagram or Twitter. And what that does is it creates a reliance one more time. And it's the norms of communication, the norms of artistry end up getting shaped by those private platforms and the pre-existing expectations of commercialism and other priorities than the community itself. Could you talk a little bit more about that difficulty of making the transition and how that impacts their voices, and what it is that they can do, but also what they can't do under those circumstances that they need to be able to do, and how could they find some other mechanism? I don't know if that makes sense, but
it does make sense. Yeah, I mean, to be frank, like I think I would want to interview more participants before giving a definitive answer, and I think that actually will be a really good interview question. So basically the question is, both during the experience of the residencies, what were some of the hesitations that maybe one would have about using this platform, and what were some of the things that it offered? And then as the project kind of picked up steam, how do you see it being shaped by some of the dynamics of a space like Instagram that's often so much about branding and sponsorship partnerships? And I mean, I can just say a little bit about what I see right now, which is that, so the video that I opened with was like kind of a very informal conversation. And it, you know, it was not, it had a lot of noise, right? Like, especially Alisha was filming outside. You could hear the whoosh of cars. We could hear kids, we could hear birds. There's another video I didn't have time to show, but it was created by storyteller and Jamie and Jai, who's like a really celebrated photographer, filmmaker based here in Pittsburgh. And it's a mini documentary about the residency, and it's for a different audience. So the audience for that one probably is more like funders, future funders. And so it's a tighter narrative. It's still very compelling and moving. But it's not quite as much about process. It's kind of more oriented towards, you know, an ask that needs to be made for resources. I think that in Knight Steele's book, which is called Digital Black Feminism, she kind of talks about how, you know, Black feminists have always had to kind of navigate this tension between being on a platform not of your own making, but sort of the imperative to survive. And so I think I would probably say, like, it'll be interesting to hear how the participating artists are thinking about this question of livelihood and sort of expression for its own sake, and if those things can ever be kind of disarticulated. Yeah.
I think one of the issues that I'm becoming so clearly aware of is the importance of developing a community that can get involved in understanding the internet platform itself and doing their own programming and getting people into computer science so that they can help create platforms that they control.
Yeah, although actually in Night Steele's book, she's a little bit critical of just the move to coding. She's kind of talking about how people like
Interesting.
do really creative work kind of within the constraints of the platform. And maybe that's why she also is emphasizing the importance of working with multiple platforms so that if one shuts down or gets taken over by Elon Musk, then, you know, you shift to another platform. But yeah, I mean, this question of building spaces, building digital spaces is really interesting. And actually, I was on a committee that was about racist platforms, and you know, talked a bit about how the structures of platforms themselves maybe lend themselves to certain kinds of attention and certain kinds of engagement. And that's actually where I learned about Wendy Chun's work, was from now Dr. E. Tribrulo, who writes about 4chan. So yeah,
Who is that again?
E. Tribrulo. I can email you, but
Oh, excellent.
yeah, he has a recently defended dissertation about 4chan and platforms and habits. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And so it's drawing a lot from Wendy Chun's work, but also some other work too.
Fascinating. Thank you.
I also I also wondered, well, as you were talking, I wondered if you'd heard about the anthropology of motherhood, or it's just anthropology of motherhood. It's an artist collective. You do know it?
Mhm.
Or curatorial or whatever. Okay, good. This project in particular kind of reminded me of that.
Yeah, I've only been to a couple of their exhibits, but they're awesome.
Yeah, I do have a more specific connection than that, just that some of the themes are.
Yeah, and it's sort of hard like to bound a project like this because it's like there's so many things that are like relevant and that are like really cool that different artist collectives are doing. So yeah.
Yeah, and then we well, just that your conversation about different platforms is relevant right now as people are you know, asking folks to stop using certain platforms like TikTok and whatever else, right? So it's privatization, it's regulation, it's a lot of different things.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, I think folks will always be sort of inventive about using what's available. But it seems like for this project, yeah, one of the things I'll need to explore more is how and why Instagram seems very successful as a medium. And I think, yeah, part of it, I think, is, as Sarah Honey Young said, it's image-based. And actually, I mean, that makes sharing a lot easier. And it kind of lends itself to a lot of the sort of autobiographical impulse that's partly at work in this project, where, you know, different participants would, you know, take over the Instagram and share little snippets of their everyday life.
Mm-hmm.
That element too. Yeah,
I liked that. So is the idea of the virtual beauty shop, you said it's like the social and communal kind of aspect. So it's just being in the beauty shop for a long time and sharing whatever's going on.
It's a really complicated concept that I'm still trying to like wrap my head around. So I'll go back to the quote because I don't want to screw it up. Let's see. Yeah, so I mean, in Night Steele's book, she's largely talking about bloggers that also become really important voices, you know, for Black feminism. And so she kind of like, through her own engagements with many years on these blogs, is identifying like practices and communicative sort of like moves that are repeatedly made. And so one of the things I didn't talk about in this talk was, you know, she talks about like posting, threading, and stitching. So she's also talking about Twitter a little bit in the book, and how, you know, there are a variety of repertoires that are sort of available by virtue of the affordance of the platform, but the way that users take them and then use them to make meaning and to build alliances is distinctive. So when she's talking about the virtual beauty shop, I think it's talking about a place or like a metaphor for a place, but it's also talking about a series of practices that are governed by a certain ethic of like communalism and collectivity. However, also with the constraints and the challenges of being in capitalist spaces driven by capitalist needs. So I think it's sort of like a space, it's a series of communicative moves, and it's a kind of like ethic or ethos. And so it could function in different ways. And she's very careful to say that we shouldn't read the virtual beauty shop as a derivative of the barber shop, which is I think how one of her advisors maybe wanted her to think about it when she wrote the disc, is what I gleaned from the intro to the book. But instead it's like it's always been its own space. That's been really important. And she kind of also sets it up in contrast to the idea of the cult of true womanhood that, you know, emerged in the US and I would say like the 18th century, which, you know, kind of like says the home is a sanctuary and white women, you know, shouldn't be involved in the messy work of labor or public life, but it's like who makes possible the capacity to create some sort of divide between public and private. It's usually the labor of people of color and often Black women. So they were never allowed access to the cult of true womanhood. So the virtual beauty shop kind of speaks to all of those sort of like longstanding challenges and tensions. So yeah, I think it's a really rich and helpful concept that I'm still trying to think through. But I was also thinking about it a lot in terms of how, you know, again, Wormsley really defines art capaciously as any kind of creative practice that has meaning-making capacity and supports communities. So like in the video, she goes on also to talk about like, do you garden? Do you braid hair? You know, do you teach yoga classes? Like these all can be seen as forms of artistry. And so I think that's really consonant with the notion of the virtual beauty shop.
It is interesting because I did think of the barber shop too. I would like to hear more about like the similarities and the differences, and you know, according to that author.
And I think in the intro of the book, she also frames it as a question of like, where are you centering your attention to? So like not like, yeah, like starting from, you know, digital Black feminist practices as central rather than just like, here's a niche area. Because that's a little bit more discipline specific, but in the field of communication, I think we've had kind of a late reckoning with the importance of understanding and thinking about questions of race and gender together. Instead, there's been more of an emphasis on sort of the public sphere as an abstraction, I would say. And so I think she's really taking up that disciplinary history and that baggage. And so when she says not derivative, I think there's some of that questioning going on too.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I don't want to say any more without having read her stuff, but it's very
I highly recommend. Do like.
okay. Thanks. What other questions or comments do we have? Any kind of final comments or anything you'd like to share, Caitlin? If not, we'll wrap up. This is a nice, I think for me, this is like the perfect amount of time for a Zoom talk. I've enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much for the invitation and for all the thoughts and the questions. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, well, likewise. Thanks everyone for being here. And we will, I wish you all a happy afternoon and a smooth rest of the semester.
All right, thank you. Take care.
Wonderful to see you. Thank you.